attack on schools during conflict. It is probably better to temporarily close the schools rather than pushing for continuing education in those circumstances. And what we saw during COVID-19 is another form of emergency where schools had to be closed to prevent the spread of virus and to save lives. Schools also served as significant spaces for political socialization during Maoist conflict. And most of the development literature talks about how teachers and students are victimized during violent conflicts. But what comes from this research is about teachers and students who were well-informed political actors in Maoist rebellion. So there were many teachers and students who were actually well aware of the need for social transformation, political change in order to provide those rights and equity and justice to the historically most marginalized populations. So there was that political activism within the education spheres as well. And what has happened recently, after the Maoist insurgency and the subsequent ethnic uprisings in the southern part of the country, is that the historical hill, high caste, male-dominated socio-political structures have been significantly ruptured. And the voices of the historically marginalized populations has come to the forefront, and as it is seen in the political outcomes in the recent elections. And it's such a coincidence that the Maoist commander has become the prime minister. I think he became prime minister a couple of weeks ago. It's quite kind of a coincidence that we're talking about Maoist insurgency now. Also, one of the conclusions that I draw from this is if education has to contribute to wider, sort of peace building and social transformation, then it needs to be reconceptualized in the sense that equity and justice need to be at the heart of educational systems. Unfortunately, most conflict-affected countries, the post-conflict settings, tend to go back to sort of business as usual. And I think in Nepal as well, there's no significant change in the education system. And I think those existing old mindsets, approaches, and paradigms continue to govern. And as a result, I think the expectations of those movements in the past have not been sufficiently addressed through education. And I think finally, I would say that the Constitution of Nepal 2015 is probably the most significant outcome of the historical movements that have taken place in Nepal, and it certainly provides the opportunity and possibilities for those changes which were imagined by people's struggles, which are about autonomy, respect for diversity, inclusion, and also empowerment of the most marginalized communities, which is yet to be seen. And I try to develop a simple framework of analysis, which is called VPLB, and many of my students actually like it, which is nice to see, where education is conceptualized as a victim, as a perpetrator, where it can create and fuel those conditions of conflict, but also it can facilitate that process of liberation by providing critical consciousness about socio-economic conditions that they live in, and they can organize and fight for justice and social change. But of course, most significantly, education can contribute to broader peace building by supporting processes of sustainable peace, but also preventing violent conflict by addressing those drivers, which I was discussing earlier. As Brad was also talking about earlier, is I think the political economy, how power and resources are distributed across different social cultural groups, and how those relationships are formed, and how those relationships are sustained or transformed over a period of time is very important, and education is implicated quite significantly in those discussions, and which is something that I try to develop at the end of the book. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, and I think one of the things that I wanted to mention is that is family, as you would always mention, and I think it's also a way of trying to impress my son, who didn't think that achieving a PhD was a significant thing in life, and this is another attempt to try and impress him. But also, yeah, thank you, and also, of course, Brad, for your enormous support for making this project possible, and I'm most grateful, and all the colleagues in my department in SEED. It's great to work together, and also all the colleagues who write in this area that I have benefited from. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Ginger for that excellent taster of so many of the interesting themes in the book, its history, and the way that it's charting paths forward through education and international development. With Leila Kadewal, who's here tonight, I've been writing about the history of education and international development at the Institute of Education. And it's a history that's kind of mired in many streams of colonialism and trying to change it. And it's such a refreshing taste of how different things can be to hear Tajendra's personal reflection on his book and thinking about where to go forward. But now it's over to the critics, and we want to hear a range of different perspectives. I'm going to pass to Dr. Uma Pradhan, who's our colleague at INSEED, with a PhD from Oxford on language education and Nepali nation, and lots of wonderful achievements in terms of her own distinguished writing. So very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elaine, for that introduction, and thank you so much, Tejinaji, for inviting me to comment on your book. I've been very much inspired by your research throughout my research career, so very much honored to be invited to read and comment and join this distinguished panel to comment on your book today. I structured my comments mainly around three broad contributions to education studies, and maybe ask two questions towards the end, and I'll try to keep within the 10 minutes that's been allocated to me. First of all, I think one of the main contributions of the book is that the book has done a very wonderful job of bringing the social and political context to contribute to the broader understanding of education and just generally education studies. Book addresses the specificity of Nepali Maoist conflict and brings this into this conflict perspective into the broader scholarship of education, especially by paying attention to politics of education. And you've discussed the difference between education politics and politics of education quite a lot in detail, which is quite a wonderful discussion in your book. During the Maoist conflict, schools and education institutions in Nepal were one of the primary victims, primary targets of violence, regardless of whether they were state institutions or whether they were public state schools or whether they were private schools. State schools were attacked because they were seen as the symbol of the state, because it was seen as state institutions and a symbol of the state, and it was seen as a space that perpetuated this particular version of Nepali nationalism, language, and state ideology. and teachers became targets of violence as they were seen as the agents of the state. And at the same time, security personnel would also arrest teachers and students as they were suspected as being Maoist activists as well. So they were being attacked from different groups for different, very contradictory accusations. And secondly, in the case of private schools, these schools were seen as class enemies by Maoist groups, in which case there were extortions, there were donations asked, there were pressures to close down these private institutions. So schools, regardless of their type, whether they were state schools or whether they were private schools, they were impacted by conflict in different ways, and the book clearly shows that they were being attacked. Many schools were destroyed, others suffered various kinds of bomb explosion, and many were caught in crossfire between rebels and security forces in different ways. So book clearly, very clearly broadens this field of education studies by focusing on this education as an area that is not merely for human capital development, but also deeply implicated in these social and political contexts. And by expanding this kind of view on education, which is very much integral part of political economy of education, as you mentioned in your book, by looking at the relationship between various power, resources, and markets, etc. I really appreciated the way you have differentiated between education policies and policies of education, and then really called for a serious commitment by political leaders in order to ensure progressive policy shifts in education as well. Secondly, I really, as I was reading the book, I really noticed how it also brings out these contradictions in education and conflict very well. There are several examples throughout the book where students were caught in conflict as direct and indirect victims, abducted, forced to join the conflict. But at the same time, there were examples where students chose to participate as Maoist cadres, where pupils they were not merely the passive victims, as you mentioned, but also influential political agents in this struggle, and were in a way provided some sort of opportunities for their children as well, who were willing to join, mainly because they were also able to obtain things like exposure, training, education, and some kind of sense of purpose as well. So it's quite an interesting contradiction in that way, that the various ways in which education and conflict may come together in this way, especially the way we can see it in the context of Nepal. Again, similarly, teachers were also participants in this political conflict, as well as the victims of the conflict. And the book has also identified how education inequality has been one of the key causes for education, but at the same time, very highly educated the people of Nepal were the leaders of this conflict. So in a way, whether to what extent education inequality or the acquisition of education are really leading to Maoist conflict. So book has done really excellent job in highlighting this kind of complex positioning of schools, complex positioning of education, which often reveals these apparently ideologically contradictory responses to conflict by their stakeholders. And as you mentioned in your book, who were simultaneously complying, enterprising, resisting, and sometimes very ambivalent to the way they were engaging with the conflict. And thirdly, the book also provides a very hopeful view of education, where change is possible within the field of education, through education institutions and through education, where education can serve as a vehicle to institutionalize and strengthen the transformative policies aimed at building sustainable peace. And you've identified immediate conflict responses such as schools as zone of peace campaigns that created pressures on warring parties to keep education institutions outside these kind of conflict activities. And at the same time, it also identifies the need to create these kinds of new discourses of nation building that could create feelings of injustice, that could address the feelings of injustice felt by different groups. So, as you noted in your book, education, you've seen that like, it has a key role in dealing with the past by looking at these different processes of history making, the present by recovering from the legacies of conflict, and the future by contributing to reconciliation and peace. So one of the important contribution I think of the book lies in this identifying education as this important arena of building sustainable peace as well. And it is in this context that I have a question as well. And the book's what I noted was the book's main focus was on this kind of spectacular or very this visible violence. And while the book traces the roots of this spectacular violence or Maoist conflict in the structural inequality and long-term chronic problems of education in Nepal, we are yet to find effective ways to deal with these issues and address these kind of more structural issues in education. And conflict in this multi-ethnic, very heterogeneous context like Nepal is a result of something that has taken place gradually over a period of time. And as we pointed out, decentralization can be, for example, strategies like decentralization and devolution of educational authority can be strategically used while maintaining control over more structural aspects of education, like national curriculum and language of instruction. And the more recent studies emerging from Nepal and to some extent my work as well show that incorporating minority language education is quite a challenge when it comes to really doing it in practice due to various issues of language hierarchy and lack of resources. Girls' education program, which was intended to address educational gender inequality in education, have led to very contradictory results where we can see more girls in government schools, but while boys are being enrolled in more sought-after private schools. So there is really, and in terms of, like, for example, there are scholarships for Dalit and indigenous groups, which are very small, but when it becomes substantial, they are usually taken over by high caste groups who are able to better navigate the bureaucratic systems. So, despite some of these shifts in policies, the lived experiences of the learners are quite dominated by these various levels of inequality. And I wonder, in this context of Nepal, do you see any kind of positive lessons on transformative policy practice emerging from Nepal that might contribute to education studies in general or broader education practice? And second question is related. The book also, you talk about children and teachers as victims and sometimes as active agents of conflict. Again, focusing on these spectacular aspects of conflict. And I wondered if there were any local or everyday responses or negotiations that you were able to see during your research, and if there are any kind of subtle ways in which people might have resisted or challenged these things that they were facing during conflict. I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much for this opportunity to read and comment on your book, and thanks so much again.
Very much for noting the historical sweep of the book. and raising some of these questions about complexity and contradiction. Are you locking them to gender? Because we'll keep ticking them off your sheet. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Hutt. He is, I learned from the web, the only professor of Nepali and Himalayan studies in the UK, and taught at SOAS, and I hope will be able to give us an extensive setting for his comments on the book. Welcome, looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yeah, okay. So again, like all of you, very many thanks for the invitation to read this book and to share some thoughts on it. I must also add my congratulations on a most impressive contribution to an ongoing international debate on conflict and education. I don't know how many of you know this, but across the UK higher education system, there is a smattering of us who work on Nepal. And we all know each other pretty well. We gather together every year for a couple of days at different university and share our research and so on. And an increasing number of us are Nepali as well, which is a new trend of recent years. So we are colleagues and we are friends and we meet very regularly. And I think it's very heartening for us to see somebody like Tejendra Yi bringing Nepal material and bringing it into a wider context, a wider debate. I actually took early retirement from SOAS 2 years ago, but I can say all through my years of supervising graduate students particularly, one of the things I often said to them was, okay, that's really very interesting, your dissertation, your essay, for us who are interested in Nepal, but what's it an example of, in the broader world? Make it interesting for somebody who doesn't know what Nepal is, so why they should be interested in Nepal. And I think Tejendra has done that in very full measure. This is a book I hope that will be read by people who don't necessarily read books about Nepal, but are interested in the topic and then will learn from the context. And I think that's a major achievement. I like very much many things about this book. I like the way also that you set out your own. I hate that word positionality. I think it's position. So you set out your own position very nicely at the beginning, where you talked about yourself and also your father, which is a very important thing to do. And I was very charmed by it. And you write very poignantly that modern education has completely uprooted us. I think referring to your own generation of internationalized, uprooted us from their origins with only nostalgia and residue. I find that very poignant. And the book as a whole, and particularly the sort of core chapters, bring the reader face to face very, very dramatically and very directly with the realities of being a school teacher, of being a school student, through a time of enormous difficulty and conflict and violence, in a very direct way. I mean, the letter you reproduced on, I think, page 91, sent to a head teacher by the Maoists. We received your letter. Are you always drunk? Why do you force us to be cruel? There are rumors that you collected the money and it's embezzled in funds. What is going on? You better explain. The chilling, threatening, mocking tone of that letter is very real. I also very much appreciated your research methods in the way in which you actually got 240 students to produce text, to produce a narrative about their experience, on which you quote quite extensively. And again, that authenticity, that directness of that experience you reproduce, I think is very, very compelling. You talk about some of the stories being very, revealing that some children were very well informed about the rationale of the Maoist rebellion. And this is where I have to make one criticism of your book, which will not be surprising to you, ultimately coming from me, but it's that you don't pay, I think, quite enough attention to Nepali language sources. So, I mean, one example of a publication that would be relevant here is the memoir of Talarai, which I'm sure you're aware of, the So it was the diary of a 13-year-old girl who left school and joined the Maoists and talks about their ideological orientation and learning and their experience at the hands of the security forces that arrested him, which I think could have been interestingly referenced. I mean, I understand that the narratives you gathered are very direct and very authentic and so on, but there are other elements there too. So I'd like to just make a couple of more reflective comments, slightly more length about some of the issues that arise from it. And first, I think, is the one that's been touched upon by everybody so far, which is this relationship between the level of development and educational provision in Nepal and the eruption of the Maoist rebellion in the 1990s. And as I was reading this book, I was remembering a conference I convened myself at SOAS in November 2001. Nepal scholars from the UK, France, and the USA, if I remember correctly, and quite a large group of journalists and academics we invited from Nepal, spent 2 days locked in a room, presenting papers and discussing what was this rebellion, why was it happening, where was it coming from. And we came up with some ideas and some preliminary sort of conclusions. Many of us linked it to poverty, oppression, marginalization, particularly among the indigenous Tanadati populations. And clearly these were factors. But also, as time has moved on, I think it's become increasingly clear that the rebellion was also the product of a very particular set of circumstances and a very particular moment in the history of Nepal, a kind of tipping point, perhaps between the relationship between educational attainment and frustrated aspiration on the one hand, particularly among people of marginal communities. And this coincided with a shift in the political configuration as multi-party democracy was re-established in the early 1990s, and then the emergence of a new political leadership. So there's a strange contradiction here, which the book examines in quite some detail, and it's surely not unique to Nepal. There's a contradiction of a rebellion against marginalization and underdevelopment, or the conditions that create those predicaments. But that rebellion not taking place until education and development have reached a certain point at which the young people at the front of this rebellion become sufficiently uncomfortably aware of their own marginalization, or something like that. And this is work, I think, that's of huge value, not just to Nepal, but across all kinds of places in conflict and with education. Other people that have worked on that, Ina Jakovic has worked on the literacy practices among the Maoists, which I think would be relevant here. And I think it's also worth saying that there's hardly a Nepali politician who hasn't read Gorky's Mother novel. There's hardly a Maoist rebel who hasn't read Chamkilo Ratukara, which is the Nepali translation of a Maoist Chinese book, Bright Red Star. So I think that out of school schooling, ideological schooling, is something that perhaps could have been said about that. I think I probably said nearly enough. Just to say one more thing. The question we sometimes ask ourselves is, if that was that moment, the marginalization of these communities is still, it's still there. It's still a factor to some extent. So, is another political rebellion likely in Nepal anytime conceivably? The answer to this seems to be broadly no. And the reasons for this are very many. And on the one hand, one could say, Ambassador, I don't know if you agree with me, but you could say that many of the Maoist demands have actually been met. Nepal is now a federal, secular, democratic republic, and it's not a unitary Hindu kingdom. On the other, however, as I've said, the same frustrations are to a large extent still there for many marginal groups and Dalits, and for women in general. But these groups seem to be working through other means other than violent revolution, by and large, to improve these conditions. My own current research in retirement is on the writing of Dalits, of those who have been historically subjugated to the lowest levels of the Hindu caste system, but are now beginning to find a voice. So let me just very quickly say a little bit about the Dalits. After an ethnic group called the Tharus, the Dalits were the second most heavily represented community among those killed during the so-called People's War. So clearly there was a widespread perception among the Dalits that violent revolution was a path that would lead to their liberation.